The Institute of World Affairs at the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee presents International Focus, a weekly discussion of the people and events behind today's global headlines. Support provided by Milwaukee Public Television and the UWM Center for International Education. Now here's your host, Rob Ricigliano.
Welcome to International Focus. Today's topic, Syria and the UN. Initially seen by some as the next generation of the Arab Spring, the crisis in Syria has degenerated into civil war. Multiple sectarian and ethnic conflicts rage as Syria's neighbors and external actors like Russia pursue agendas that do little to resolve the crisis. As the violence continues, it has fallen to the United Nations to try to pursue the peace. In addition to providing basic services for the estimated 300,000 refugees displaced by the fighting, the UN has mounted a mission to find a political solution to the conflict. To help us explore how and why the United Nations has stepped in where great powers are unwilling or unable to tread, we're joined by Ellen Laipson, Chief Executive Officer of the Stimson Center, a nonpartisan institution devoted to enhancing international peace and security. She also directs the center's Middle East Southwest Asia program, focusing on security issues in the region. Ellen Laipson, welcome to International Focus.
Thank you. Glad to be here.
Ellen, I'm wondering if you could start us off by giving us taking stock a bit of the situation as we see it now in Syria, what the big challenges are, what the big needs are.
Mm-hmm. The situation on the ground is very disturbing and unstable and getting worse. The UN is estimating that as of early October, there were roughly 300,000 Syrians who had fled across the borders to Turkey, Lebanon, or Jordan. But they are expecting these numbers to mount to more than double that by the end of the calendar year. So that means in literally 10 weeks, we're expecting an outflow of tens of thousands of people, of additional Syrians. The Syrian government has not let up in its aerial bombardment of cities, and the opposition seem to be gaining some more capabilities, but are certainly not prevailing in terms of order of battle or able to push back the government forces. So we're seeing more car bombs in cities while the regime is trying to intimidate and suppress the very disparate kinds of opposition that we're seeing. I think one of the biggest problems for the international community is we don't have a handle on who all the opposition actors are, how much outside influence there is on them. We know, obviously, because some countries are saying it openly, that they are trying to support the opposition, including with military support. But this opposition is not, the military side of the opposition and the political side are not aligned, and there's not a coherent leadership with whom the international community can work yet. So it's a chaotic situation. It is a worsening situation. In addition, the conflict appears to be on the cusp of broadening beyond Syria's borders. So we're now seeing intermittently Turkish-Syrian military interaction, violence in Lebanon that is clearly driven by the Syrian crisis, and a very nervous Jordan worrying that they're going to be the next victim.
So I mean, you mentioned the challenges facing the international community, and this seems to be one of those cases where this didn't happen overnight. I mean, this has sort of been a very, very slow boil to get to this point. Now is possibly boiling over the borders. How is it the international community has not found a way to engage, and that it has fallen on the UN to step in?
Well, the international community and the UN, in some ways, are the same thing. So I'm not sure I would posit them as alternatives. You could argue that a small group of great powers would have been the alternative strategy. But I don't think any of the outside actors want to take this on. And you had said earlier in your setup piece that, you know, what we thought was just another chapter of the Arab Spring. I mean, let's remember, this started out as very peaceful, nonviolent protests by largely urban, secular, middle-class forces that finally worked up the courage to say, you know, we're sick of our government. But it did degrade into something much nastier. and the government upped the ante. And so there was not a moment where the outside world quite had the opportunity or the right moment to get involved in a productive way. And I would say that the UN has responded on behalf of the international community. There were Security Council resolutions in the spring and summer that authorized very specific activities by the UN. So let's not forget that until mid-August, there was actually a small peace monitoring operation because for a brief moment the parties thought they had worked out some kind of a deconflicting agreement. But that did fall apart in mid-August, and the UN pulled out I think it was 3,000, no, it was more than that. It was tens of thousands of observers, and they had to be withdrawn. So the UN's role today exists on several levels. At the top, there's Lakhdar Brahimi, this very experienced Algerian diplomat who's been a UN troubleshooter for quite some time. And Lakhdar Brahimi has replaced Kofi Annan as the special envoy of UN Secretary General Ban Ki-moon, trying to cajole and goad and persuade the government of Bashar al-Assad to actually engage in some kind of a political process with the opposition. The opposition themselves are quite divided. Some say, yes, we'll negotiate even with Bashar al-Assad so long as the deal is that he will have to leave power. Others will say, no way, we will not talk to him. We have to wait until after he's gone to begin that political process. Right now, as we speak in the third week of October, Lakhdar Brahimi is trying to negotiate just a cessation for a Muslim holy day, for the Eid al-Adha. And that, one hopes, if there was agreement to just stop for the Muslim holiday, then perhaps it could be extended and it could turn into something more protracted. At the same time, the UN is on the ground. More than 1,000 UN employees are in 7 different locations across Syria providing humanitarian services. Every day they're trying to keep schools open, they're providing basic health services, they are dealing with the 1 million+ internally displaced Syrians, and they're also dealing across the border with the 300,000 refugees that I spoke of. So the UN is operating at several different levels here. Some of them, by definition, are already productive and providing real services, but at the highest political level, no guarantee that they will succeed.
So I think it's a distinction that often gets lost on those that are observers of the United Nations, and they sort of see the difficult political task that the UN has and how frustrating that is, but they don't see the humanitarian relief and the on-the-ground relief. Is that so in a sense, the UN will get sort of criticized for the difficulty of the political mission and not credited for
That's right.
the humanitarian mission.
That's right.
So how does the UN, how do they deal with that? I mean, how is it a bit of a catch-22 where they get the blame but not the credit?
Not the credit. Well, I think that has been a dilemma for quite some time. I mean, at the end of the Cold War, we thought that political dysfunctionality had ended. There was that long period where it was a zero-sum game, that either the U.S. wanted something or the Soviet Union wanted something, but we never wanted the same thing at the same time. The 90s was kind of a blossoming of the UN and certainly the peacekeeping world, because together the U.S. and Soviet Union, Russia, wanted to solve all these festering conflicts, particularly in Africa, but also in Central America and in Southeast Asia, et cetera. So there was a period of tremendous productivity and a healing of that long period, those wounds of the Cold War. Strangely enough, Syria feels like a flashback to me. It feels like that old period where the U.S. and Russia are just on opposing sides, and both sides dig their heels in, and you can't get anything done. The Russians, for a variety of reasons, some of which are pretty straightforward. I mean, Syria is the closest thing to a partner or an ally or a client state that the Russians have left in the Arab world. They have a port on the Mediterranean. They sell arms to Syria. They do want to preserve a secular, centralized, strong government in Syria. They don't trust either the Islamists or the opposition, the other opposition, to kind of keep the place together. So, think of Russia under Putin. They kind of like the Bashar al-Assad regime. This is something that they can identify with. So the Russians have decided that their own state interest is sticking with this regime. one would hope that at least some constituencies in Russia would start to be thinking a little more strategically and saying, but sooner or later there's going to be change here. This place is really not working anymore. And they would begin to position themselves for life after Bashar al-Assad, but we haven't seen it yet. But I mean, I take your earlier point that the specialized agencies, the work that the UN is doing all the time in global governance, in keeping these global systems, in protecting the global commons, doesn't always get the glamour. But it's really where the UN touches most people's lives, not the Security Council. So we watch the Security Council and we sort of find fault with the UN, and we're forgetting that really the big piece of how they really change people's lives comes in this less political and more operational work that they do.
Well, so just stay on that sort of image of how the UN touches people's lives. If you had to sort of rate or rank the significance of how, I mean, the political mission obviously touches people's lives. I mean, if you can draw the active fighting to a close, that's a really important step. On the other hand, as you mentioned, you're talking about relatively few people involved in that political process, and thousands on the UN side, millions on the Syrian side involved in the other mission. So in terms of longer term, so yes, political events will unfold. Assad may leave, and many people think he will at some point. Which of those two missions is going to touch the most people's lives sort of over the long term?
Well, it's true that strategically it is the Security Council that has to make the big decisions about war and peace. You know, are we going to send peacekeepers? Are political negotiations going to be successful? And obviously there's a lot more work to be done in Syria. The moment is not yet ripe where the Syrian government and the opposition are ready to talk. They don't agree on what the basic terms would be. So the UN's more strategic contribution would be if that political process works. If the political process fails and this just drags on as a humanitarian crisis, then the UN keeps plugging away, but it doesn't feel like a success. It feels like you're just putting Band-Aids on a very big problem. And that's the reality in which the UN works. You know from your own work that in some of the post-conflict situations in Africa and elsewhere, the UN has sometimes been successful in quiet ways when these countries are long past the headlines of, you know, the civil war just ended in Liberia and the UN comes rushing in and people are interested. 10 years later, the UN may still be on the ground, chugging away, building political institutions, helping public health services, working with education ministries, really building these countries back up again, but long after the international public has paid much attention.
So we're just about at our break, Ellen. I want to give you a little warning because I'm going to give you a quiz after the break. So it's Libya and Syria, compare and contrast.
Okay.
So before Ellen answers, we'll take a little bit of a break. We'll be back in just a moment on International Focus.
The Institute of World Affairs presents our community with a range of public programs relating to global issues, U.S. foreign policy, and the world economy. For more information about the Institute of World Affairs, call 414-229-3220 or visit our website at www.iwa.uwm.edu.
Welcome back to International Focus. We're talking about Syria and the UN with Ellen Laipson of the Stimson Center. So Ellen, I gave you the question before the break. So a lot of people are frustrated with the inaction in Syria because we're just fairly, the memory of the intervention in Libya is still fresh in people's minds. People generally think that was successful. Why in the world aren't we doing it in Syria? What's the difference?
Okay, it's an interesting dilemma because I think the overhang of Libya is playing out in some curious ways. As you may recall, the U.S. helped lead and organize what was essentially a NATO. It was Turkey, France, Italy, the U.S., with a little bit with participation also from one or two Gulf Arab countries, decided that the risk that Muammar Gaddafi was going to massacre people in the last chaotic days of his regime led this group of countries under UN auspices, with a UN blessing, with a UN Security Council resolution, to launch a military operation that was largely aerial. It was Air Force, principally for both reconnaissance and for degrading Gaddafi's Air Force. And it did succeed. Gaddafi fled, he fell from power, the regime, this international military intervention was able to wrap up quickly, a Libyan opposition emerged, and everybody felt pretty good about it, and including some European military officers who were kind of thrilled that this was their first time. They led, and the U.S. played a supporting role, not the lead role. But after it was over, while the Western countries were kind of congratulating themselves at how well it went, the countries of the South, I mean, a lot of countries that weren't necessarily sympathetic to Gaddafi, but want to be very careful about how the big countries kind of move their military power around, decided that there was a little bit of bait and switch here, that what went in as a civilian protection mission to protect innocent Libyan civilians from being massacred really turned into being a regime change intervention. Now, the two were related. I mean, you can't separate them so neatly. But as a consequence of this perception that, we went in saying it was for humanitarian purposes, but really what we wanted to do was accelerate Gaddafi's demise, that has influenced countries' attitudes about whether a similar mission for Syria would be desirable. The countries that did the Libya intervention really aren't ready to do it again in Syria. They see a lot of military impediments. They think that Syria is just harder for a whole bunch of reasons. It's a more advanced country militarily. The population is denser, more concentrated. The risk of casualties is greater, etc. So there's a lot of reasons why they don't want to do it. But more importantly, the permission to do it may not come from the UN again. Now, this is very frustrating to the Syrian opposition. I mean, they're just crying. Where are you? Why aren't you helping us? You say you wanted to save lives in Libya. What about us? We're dying every day, and you're not coming to our help. So it's one of those painful predicaments that the UN gets in sometimes, where there's such a gap between, there's such a failure to achieve a clear consensus in the international community about what's the right thing to do next, that the UN becomes passive.
If we look at, you mentioned sort of the potential for UN, approval as there had been in Libya, even if it wasn't the action wasn't implemented necessarily, the military action wasn't implemented by the UN. So the big stumbling block has been Russia and Russia's opposition to that. Is that the whole story? Is Russia sort of, are they the only holdout on this? What's the reason why we haven't seen really a consensus at the UN on? Well,
there's a lot more texture to the story if we want. I mean, the Chinese hide behind the Russians, Iran, countries that are sympathetic to Iran, which is under so many sanctions by the UN, are probably also digging in their heels because Iran doesn't want a military intervention to oust Bashar al-Assad. So, there's certainly a richer story if we want to go down a layer or two of what are truly the interests of all the other countries. But if we keep it simple and just say, why hasn't the Security Council figured out a more proactive next step, I think it is Russia versus the others. And the Russians, as I said, they can articulate their own national interests. Sooner or later, though, I think the Russians are not going to want to be left defending a dying regime. They're going to want to position themselves for whatever happens after Bashar al-Assad. But so far, that is not the way President Putin wants to present Russia's position.
You mentioned earlier about the potential consequences regionally now if the conflict in Syria does spill over its borders, or it already has to some degree with refugees, and a little bit of Syria's bombed some border villages in Turkey, for example. What does the regional picture look like, and the interests of Syria's neighbors in dealing with that conflict?
Yeah, I think it's getting a little bit scary and rough around the edges right now. We don't know, but certainly one scenario is that it really does kind of split along sectarian lines. So you've got the Sunni Arab states, Saudi Arabia, Egypt, and others, really upping the ante on the side of the opposition. And you've got Iran and Russia still trying to keep Bashar in power because they fear the alternatives. They don't think, and we, quite frankly, should also fear the chaos that might emerge from the collapse of the regime. But just like the way the two candidates debated it in their last foreign policy debate, once the Arab Spring happened, once a country kind of revolts and says we no longer accept the legitimacy of our government, you kind of have to go with it. What's the point of trying to hold out and keep a non-democratic leader in power? That's just not the way it works in the 21st century. So even if you harbor a lot of anxieties about what's going to come after Assad, if the will of the people is being expressed in this pre-democratic country, this country that doesn't have democratic institutions and doesn't really know how to demonstrate other than in the street and eventually with guns, really the role of the outside actors is very constrained. We don't have as much leverage on Bashar al-Assad as we'd like to believe we do. Our sympathies may be with at least the peaceful opposition or the opposition that we think, but that opposition is under huge psychological stress right now. Some of them are getting radicalized for sure. Some of them are following under the influence of bad actors. And so we don't know whether there's a coherent, cohesive alternative to Bashar al-Assad.
So if I forced you, which I am, to look in your crystal ball and sort of think about possible future scenarios and where this might go and what role the UN might be able to play in those scenarios, what do you see as the possible future directions this might go?
Well, let me pick up the thread of the way you had earlier asked the question that I think I didn't fully respond to. So the UN does want to work with regional organizations. I mean, one of the other things that has evolved over the years is that the UN doesn't have all the answers, and they do want whatever their actions are to be seen as legitimate and validated by people who are part of that culture, whatever it may be. So right now, for example, the Arab League and the UN are talking a lot and coordinating their actions. The other thing that has emerged is what they're calling the Islamic Quartet, and President Morsi of Egypt, when he was at the General Assembly in September, announced that there was now this new regional body. It's fragile and it's not really doing much yet, but what an interesting idea. Egypt, Turkey, Iran, and Saudi Arabia together trying to use their collective leverage on the Syrian parties, but under a UN umbrella. So, why not have these different layers? Whoever can influence and help shape the perceptions of people in this war, the more the better. And so sometimes there's a regional layer and the UN layer, and the two can, hopefully can work constructively together.
So where do you see the most traction? In other words, is it through that more the route where the regional actors maybe take more of the lead and the UN is supporting, or is it likely to be, will it come down to military intervention? Where do you see this going?
Well, in the Middle East, unlike in Africa, what you have that gives more power to the regional actors is they have money. Sometimes in the poorest of the poor countries, it would have to come back to the UN, and then there's this, ritual of trying to raise money for a special campaign to help East Timor or, Haiti. It's voluntary contributions, and it's a special campaign. In the case of Syria, there is regional money being organized and spent in ways that where the UN may not be the sole decision maker. So there could also be a little bit of disagreement from time to time on how to spend the money. So if the Saudis come in and say we're only funding Sunnis, well, the UN has to look at this differently. The UN has to look at humanitarian need irrespective of religion, ethnicity, etc. So you do have they're on slightly different planes of how they might act, but I do believe that the regional players are increasingly important. In the case of the Middle East, these are all regional, these are middle powers, these are countries of some consequence. The Turks, seeing that this quartet hasn't really been able to do anything yet, in part because the Saudis, to be honest, are conflicted. They don't want to sit in meetings with the Iranians. This is hard for them. So the Turks have come in and tried to, because the Turks can bridge. The Turks can talk to Iran, they can talk to the Sunni Arab states, and so they're scrambling to come up with whatever formula works. Is it 3 countries? Is it 4 countries? How can we work together? But I think the UN increasingly wants the regional actors to do their part, including sometimes you start with a UN peacekeeping operation and it turns into a regional one, or vice versa. It starts regional and then it goes up to blue helmets. So there's all kinds of variable geometry here. Wherever the energy and the initiative and the resources and the political will exist, can be fit into something that is largely consistent with what the UN is tasked to do.
Ellen, thank you very much for that overview from Syria. Now, I would be remiss if I didn't ask you, if people want to find out more about the Stimson Center and the issues that you follow and do, how would they learn more?
Thank you. We are www.stimson.org. Very simple, STIMSON. Our think tank is named for Henry Stimson, who was a Secretary of State and War in the early part of the 20th century, believed very much in pragmatic approaches, non-ideological approaches to American engagement in the world, and we work in that spirit to try to find smart solutions to the problems of the day.
Ellen Laipson of the Stimson Center, thank you very much for joining us in International Focus.
Thank
to
you,
our
Rob.
viewers, we'll see you next week. Take care.
For information about the Institute of World Affairs and its many programs, or to become a member of the Institute, call 414-229-3220 or visit us at our website,